All right, looks like we're all back. So we'll take a little bit of time before moving on to the presenters to discuss this together. And we can, of course, continue this conversation once the presenters have concluded, just sort of segue in that manner. But does somebody from room one want to share something that went on? So Charles, Malika, Patrick, or Robbie, want to share some things you guys talked about?
I feel like we talked about all the questions, but I feel like they all kind of like grouped into the same kind of key points about the double consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And we just kind of talked about how like it does lead into racial tensions today, and like there still is that double consciousness. And Robbie gave a good example for the third question too. I'm sure he probably has it up there. That was like a very specific example from the text and from the comment that was very explanatory. And I feel like that's how it was, or the quote from that text that he used obviously is like from years and years and years ago, but I feel like people kind of say the same things today, just worded a tad bit differently, and like think that they're not saying that same phrase, if that makes sense.
Are you referring to the comment reading?
Yeah.
Okay. Robbie, did you want to share that or?
Yeah, I think the best example I could think of in the moment was at the very end when Julia's father showed up, and pretty much, Jim didn't really say anything. He kind of remained quiet, and that was kind of the moment in the story where everything kind of reverted and went back to how they kind of were before, because Julia's father is a racist white male who kind of has been one of the reasons white society has been formed, or the conditions have been formed. So Jim couldn't really say much because he could have feared being killed by these guys because they're talking about lynching him, and
right.
that the white people assumed that he was doing bad things to Julia, when in reality he was helping her. And I think another good example, it's not from this text, but the other story you attached for I Fit the Description.
Mm-hmm.
I think that whole story just describes double consciousness, where Steve has to take extreme precautions when being accused by the police officers. Like if he reaches into his pocket, he has to let them know.
Mm-hmm.
He can't argue back. He can't really defend himself because his fear is literally death. So he has to do these things so that he can be alive in white society.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you brought up those two accounts specifically, or two moments, because I think you're right that they really do exemplify this phenomenon of double consciousness in a way that's invisible to those standing outside of the experience. So what's so striking about the John Locke story, that personal account, is by all external appearances, indeed, the understanding of the situation by the police officers involved, it was perfectly friendly, professional, and more or less innocuous, right? There was no real threat. They were just doing their job. As they said insistently, we have to check it out. We have this report. We're just doing this by procedure. And there was no issue. Yet, within the consciousness of Steve Locke, he could have died, as you pointed out, right? So the stakes couldn't have been higher ultimately. And he was thinking of all these ways that the scenario might develop and unfold, which would have been completely outside of the consideration of those bystanders or police officers, right? So that's a great example. Cool. So what about room two? So Nancy, I just had the chance to read your contribution to the discussion forum. Maybe would you want to share some thoughts in relation to what you wrote?
Of course. Sorry. I forgot what I wrote though.
Well, you can go back and check it out. So I'm going to open it up here. But I thought there were many important insights that you arrived at in your
I came across the first quote and I don't know, I was really shocked with how like he had to get out of the building really quick, because if he didn't, then they would have accused him of all the things that were around, like robbery or something, and the death of those people that were on the ground.
Mhm.
So I guess like for that, it's like everyone is like so quick to judge and they just assume things without asking. And I think because he's an African American, then he wouldn't get treated the same way. So they wouldn't bother to ask him. They would just automatically assume that.
Yeah,
And
so
it's
that's
like
great. Yeah. So then it's like, for this particular character's experience, Jim, of course, he's dealing with what he understands to be a global catastrophe as he discovers, venturing around the city, more details of what happened as a result of the comet. So he has to confront the annihilation of the very world that he recognizes, but at the same time, before that even develops, he has to grapple with this external perception of himself as a Black body from the guise, or excuse me, from the perspective of white America having adopted a sort of universal, a kind of false universal guise, or positionality. So if it were a white character under the same circumstances, that thought never would have occurred to him, right? So he would have been able, without that additional layer of anxiety, to venture out into the world to see what's going on. But Jim is carrying that weight with him as he proceeds in that manner too. So I thought that was a really good example, Nancy. And you said some other cool things too that we might have a chance to talk about. But was there anything else you wanted to mention?
well, just like the second one as well, like how he wasn't allowed to eat at that restaurant the day before, but like that day, since like no one was there, he was able to like try it out and see how it was.
Yeah, but it's even more disturbing than that, because he was able to enjoy what other Americans are able to enjoy every day without any sort of question or difficulty, yet it was from the hands of a corpse. So that's particularly disturbing. One of the more, I think, powerful moments in the story. But yeah, that's another really good example. And so that was a morbid opportunity that arose for Jim, but only because the very social structure that had foreclosed that for him as a member of society had dissolved, right? So it became an opportunity to eat from the hands of a corpse, which, yeah, it's particularly powerful. So good. How about someone from room 3? So Kayla, Ale, or Karina, did you guys want to share something that you talked about?
So we talked a bit about how, so question 2 is about how like Du Bois's idea was that like a big catastrophe is the only thing that could end racism because of how deeply like intertwined it is with everything we do in our entire society. We talked a bit about how it, like, even though there was a comment, like there's still like racism that is happening afterwards, and like, yeah, people are like apologizing for it, but it's still there. And so even after that, there's still this boundary that needs to be overcome, and this way of thinking that has been entrenched in all of our minds that we need to get over.
So you're talking about the end of the story?
Yeah, like when the dad came back and asked about like if he tried anything, and she said no, he saved me. And then after the other people were told that, someone still said like we should lynch him and stuff like that.
Yeah, and also connected to the example and the point that Robbie was making with respect to the example, what does the father do, right? He's not completely vocal about joining the aggressive mob, but instead he extends like a fistful of money to Jim.
And offers him a job.
Yeah, and from his point of view, so from Julia's father's point of view, he's being perfectly civil, accommodating, friendly, and perhaps even supportive and progressive. But of course, from Jim's point of view, that's deeply insulting.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not something that those who are incapable of recognizing the situation at hand, given their unfamiliarity with the lived reality or lived experience. So in this way, what we're dealing with here, this sort of discrepancy in perspective in concrete lived experience and the attunement to social reality connects to our discussion of Hume. So it's very difficult to create or to address or recognize the substance of an idea if the very sensory and experiential pathways through which such ideas are emergent and structured and colored in different manners and communicated to others and so forth isn't available. So if those pathways are shunted off, it's difficult to recognize what's going on in terms of the lived perspective of the other, as we could describe it here in this context. So good. Room 3, was there anything else that you guys talked about that you think would be interesting to share?
Well, we also mentioned that even throughout the story, it was like clear because even though that she knew that it was like deep down that it was only those two left, it was still hard for her to get past the fact that he was Black. Like when she goes to look for her father, she starts to run through the alley and tries to get away from him, but then she ends up coming back. It just took her a long time to get over the fact. And when she did, she realized he was human and a gentleman, just like some of the people around her.
Great, yeah, there's a moment in the story towards the end in which the characters achieve something close to the Hegelian notion of equal recognition. And so as readers, we're given access to the difficult process through which that occurs. This kind of adjustment, self-doubt, anxiety, discomfort, misguided expectations, and so forth that within the story, because the very society that stood as an obstacle towards the eventuality of such equal or equitable recognition dissolved. But once that was basically revived or resuscitated from the dead, those boundaries or limits were reintroduced. Although there's some sense that there is something of a lasting transformation or change when it comes to the main characters. What was I going to say? Yeah, so actually there's, in terms of the deep philosophical insights that can be mined from the story, there are 3 points of false identity or examples of poor recognition, unequal recognition, such that Jim's character is reduced at different moments in the story to either a thing, just a sort of inert object, or a creature, that is a subhuman creature, or a stranger. And a stranger in a really deep sense, that is a kind of cultural stranger, not just an individual within one's own culture that is simply unfamiliar or unknown, but someone who by their very ontological constitution, in terms of how they self-present as the being that they are a stranger. And so there's a contemporary philosophy of race theorist, Charles Mills, who's also involved in the social contract tradition. And so in that way, he has a recent book from about 10 years ago. It's called The Racial Contract. It's very interesting. And he talks about how Black and brown bodies within a white dominant society like the United States present, even as they move through different normative spaces where there are different expectations and rules carved up and so forth, they present as little bubbles of wildness, such that, and we can see this played out dramatically sometimes funnily, but hilariously, but some more often than not the phenomenon of the police calling Karen, right? So there's the example of a year or maybe a year and a half ago of a student at Yale University, a young Black woman who was asleep in the dormitory where she lived, and another student, a white student, called the police on them because they were clearly out of place. They shouldn't have been there. The police arrived and the student showed them her room, her dorm, and it still wasn't sufficient. So there are parallels here to the Steve Locke story. She had to show ID, right? So she had to justify her presence. And this is what social theorists now describe as an example of a microaggression, which, like what Steve Locke endured in his account, which from his point of view is quite harrowing and threatening, is perfectly harmless from the sort of point of view of white dominant society. And so that's the sense in which Jim's character is reduced to a kind of stranger in a stronger metaphysical sense than simply someone that you don't happen to know yet, because it means that in virtue of their otherness, of their strangeness, they're not someone that you, as a member of white society, for example, supposedly the universal society, can engage in a equal relationship with. They're always going to be this stranger or this other. And that's a function that unfolds and enacts itself, that's in operation in virtue of the veil, which is a figure that demarcates the color line in Du Bois's sociology and his philosophy. And so we can then name the veil, perhaps, the veil itself, as this demarcating kind of social structure, an instrument of social structuration even. We can call it white supremacy. So then the veil is this sort of ideology of white supremacy enacted in the social conditions by which individuals can come to recognize or fail to recognize one another. Okay. Good. Any other comments on this?
I just wanted to say one more thing about the equal recognition thing at the end.
Mhm.
So the end was kind of confusing, like about how suddenly like their family just came back or stuff like that. That was kind of confusing for me. So I kind of thought the moral of the story, or one of the points of the story, was that when they did see each other as equal on top of the building, like I thought like they did eventually see each other as equal. That's when their family came back to them.
Yeah, like pretty much right on the heels of that profound transformative moment. That's when it all came just sort of crashing down. The new sort of emancipated view of an open future was sort of crushed. And then there's another powerful moment too that happens at the end that we'll talk about, but I wanted to give the presenters a chance in case I'm stepping on their toes. But yeah, so I wanted to talk some more a little bit later about the end of that story, because there's some important biographical details of Du Bois that aren't really exactly necessary to understand what's going on in that moment, but can certainly be helpful and illuminating. So we'll talk about that. All right. So if there aren't any further comments to extend what we've discussed, maybe we can go ahead with the presenters. So are you guys ready to go?
Yeah, I think I'm going to share my screen
Oh, I have
with our
to.
slides.
I have to
Yeah.
make you a co-host. So let me do that. All right, Robbie, so now you should be able to share your screen.
Sounds good. All right, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So we are group A, and we did the connection between W.E.B. Du Bois, the story of the comet and the souls of Black folk, as well as I also included some connections between the story of Steve Locke. So a brief summary of the souls of Black folk sections that we were assigned. The forethought, Du Bois gives this section to give the readers an idea about what it was like to be a Black person in the beginning of the 20th century. He explains the color line, or or the veil, as we just talked about, which is the divide between races. And he also explains the purpose and the summary of each section in the rest of the reading. And then the next section after that was of our spiritual strivings. Du Bois explains how Black people don't receive the same chances and feel imprisoned by white society. This causes Black people to always have to view themselves from the perspective of white society, giving them a double consciousness because they are forced to conform to these ideals. He also explains how education has helped Black people understand all the challenges they have faced so that they can aim to fix them. His solution is not to oppose other races, but to use conformity to strengthen the ideals of American society. He believes that if Black people adapt and influence American ideals, then Black society will begin to reflect in American history in a positive way and will begin to reform the societal constructs.
For the brief summary of the comment, pretty much Du Bois just writes a short story discussing the relationship between Jim, who is a Black man, and Julia, who is a young white woman. And when a comet hits New York, it unleashes toxic gases, they think, killing everyone in New York except them. The reasoning of the survival for this one white woman was because of her wealth. And the comet helped lay a foundation for Afrofuturism, which is a movement within literature and art and music, just helping like explain Black history and culture. And this part is just explaining part of the story. And first, the two characters were terrified about the events that occurred. However, they began to feel a sense of freedom from societal constructs. At the end, the new ideals that Julia was beginning to feel diminished when her father found her, which just kind of, sums up a majority of the story.
And then the connections between the two readings, although they were first horrified, Jim and Julia felt a sense of freedom after the comet sweeps through the city. They came to realize that more things are possible in their life without a social constructs that they were held to before. And then the catastrophe caused by the comet has revealed racial constructs formed by the white society and has removed the possibility for double consciousness that Jim could have felt beforehand because he no longer has to satisfy the constructs.
I added a slide in that connected all this with Locke's story as well. As I said before, Steve Locke was falsely accused being victimized by police officers for another person who apparently broke into a white woman's home. Locke had to take extreme precaution while talking to the police officers with his actions and his words because he didn't want to cause any trouble because he feared death. And this is just a simple example of double consciousness, which forces Black people to act in ways that will conform to the constructs of white society. It's very similar to the events of the George Floyd situation. However, George Floyd was someone who tried to defend himself and opposed the police officers, and that resulted in his death. So that simply explains why Locke fears for his life. And then I can kind of move into my connection section here, and I also had a couple questions. I mean, for me, as a white male, I've grown up in a super small town. I went to school from elementary through high school with the same exact people. I'm from Hood River, Oregon. It's not a very big place. So there wasn't really ever any racial issues going on because we have a lot of diversity and we all knew each other. So it was pretty rare that it happened there. So that kind of shows how I was blinded for such a long time up until the events of the Black Lives Matter movements. And then, that just shows how I have a pretty privileged life. I'm a white male. I was unaware of these issues up until then. And then I also agree with Locke's opinions on education, because he believes better education for Black people will start to improve these issues of white society. However, there's a lot of issues with our educational system because there are some schools that Black people are not able to make it into, or the schools that where most Black people live are not as good compared to the white neighborhoods, because there's a bunch of private schools out there that are super expensive to get into, and white society has made it so only usually white people can get into these schools or have the ability to get into these schools.
So public schools are funded by property taxes. So obviously the more affluent neighborhoods are going to have the better funded schools with superior resources.
Exactly, yeah. So that's something that I've connected with, or that I've learned. I can't really connect because my where I'm from, there's only public school, or you can go to a private Christian school with 6 other people in your grade. So that wasn't really an interest for me. There was this quote here that stood out to me the most. It was just basically it was a pretty big turning point for at least Julia. She basically asks how much, or has he worked, and Jim says he's always been working, and how she says she's a wealthy white woman, she hasn't had to work at all in her life. So that kind of brings up some questions for me. And the comment, is it greater than just racial issues, but could it also involve gender issues as well? Because Julia has been kind of held away from a lot of things, and her life has been formed by her family members.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember she was looking out ahead at the world, and she was like, I can make a life for myself now. So I think
I'm really
you can
glad
see a
you
bigger
brought that.
picture in this.
Yeah, there's certainly some gender inequality issues as well. And it's worth noting that historically Du Bois was also heavily involved in the fight against sexism. So he was a major supporter of women's suffrage, for example. And he recognized, to some extent too, what we now call the phenomenon of intersectionality. So recognizing the important intersection of racial identity and gender or sexual identity. And so we're talking about the early 20th century here, which is pretty impressive, I would say.
All right, well, that's all I had to really say, so we'll move on here.
So a lot of my things kind of agreed with what Robbie was saying. And for me, I mean, I am African American, and I did grow up in a very like not as diverse town, I guess you'd say. And so like I was the only Black person at my middle school, and probably like one of the 10 in high school. And so like I never really recognized a lot of like the racial remarks and other things made as a child, because it never would cross my mind like that, because everyone was my friend. And so like there were certain times where like everyone else was offered things before I was offered things, with simple stuff like in classes and other events like at school. And I never really was like, I was always kind of just blinded to that, because I never thought of it in that way until I honestly kind of got to college, and it was a lot more diverse, and people are a lot more like spoken or speak up a lot more about things. And so that was kind of like my intake on that. And I think regarding to the educational system, like Robbie had talked about, I think our at least for history wise, teach us a very whitewashed, so say, way of teaching things. And like, I hate to say that, but it's kind of like, for my history classes in high school, I had we only talked about Black history during Black History Month, and we only were ever able to watch a couple movies about the two people you always hear about, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And, we got to talk about everyone else's history the rest of the year. And there was always this like, kind of bias towards things too. So when we would talk about African American history, it would be kind of a degrading thing. And compared to like, like when we're talking about just American history in general, like it was this great thing and we looked so highly up to it. And then we look at African American history and yeah, like things were bad for African Americans, but there are like good things that you could talk about that like, people have overcame, and like things are progressing, and we never just learned about that. So I think that giving like obviously like reforms around the education system need to be made. And I think that giving all students of all races a good educational background can really help change things.
Yeah, good. And so Du Bois talks about that, right? On our spiritual strivings.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about education as the pathway to real freedom, beyond even the freedom of what happened once, after the Civil War, the institution of slavery was legally overturned. He mentions that this was a particularly difficult moment for African Americans because they were left in a state of uncertainty and ambivalence, given that they were sort of ripped from any kind of intimate or familiar historical and cultural milieu. So they couldn't trace their ancestry back, which can be, importantly for a given culture, members that participate in it, a ground from which to be oriented towards the future. So African Americans in this period lacking that, had no real clear idea of where they were going. And so education became the true medium through which a kind of individual freedom could be achieved in terms of one's consciousness. And so that connects to the problem of double consciousness. And like you were saying, Malika, in terms of history, how students are taught that. So there is this special month, February, every year, where people can focus on Black history or African American history. And the subtle or not so subtle implication is that history without a qualifier, so just history, is then white history. So that's another sense in which whiteness takes on this false status of being universal or global, when in fact it's just one partial view. As Frantz Fanon puts it, so he's an important theorist of race, a post-colonial philosopher and sociologist, also a psychoanalyst. And following Du Bois, he did important work, I think, on the concept of double consciousness. But he points out that this perspective of universal whiteness falsely identifies itself as the only civilization, but in fact, it's just one historical civilization among others. And Fanon adds to that, and it's not the kindest. It's not the best, by the way, in terms of moral fortitude, moral equity. So yeah, I think I'm really glad you brought up the problem of historical education in our public education system. That's really important. So yeah, go on. Sorry, I didn't want to take.
Oh, you're fine. And so I kind of I totally agree with Robbie. Like, I'm a white female. I went to private Catholic school my whole life. So I honestly was really sheltered and had no idea. We had one Black person in our school, and he was my age, and he was like one of my best friends. So I never really was surrounded by anything like that. And so up until Black Lives Matter is when it was brought before my eyes. And going to SOU, the volleyball team was really invested in it, and we would talk about it a lot. And I was shocked. And so then I started doing my own research, and it was crazy that stuff back then was still going on, like, and is going on today, that I had no idea about. And so that's where I agree with Makey, is that, you know, changing how like the history is taught in the classroom would be beneficial. And because history, you think, oh my God, that was so long ago, but in reality, it's still going on today. And yeah, it would help people.
Yeah, and so remember the quotation um, from James Baldwin, that history is a nightmare from which we would like to awake, but we can't. So it's a sort of nightmare that lives with us in a more often than not liminal way, but it arises in points of our concrete experience. Yeah, and that's kind of what gets dismantled in the short story until it's resuscitated at the surprise of the characters at the end. If the societal institutional conditions that have preserved the color line falls away, then perhaps we can awake. The suggestion or implication is maybe we can awake from the nightmare of history. But then that possibility was sort of quickly snatched away in a kind of nihilistic or pessimistic, at least, manner at the end of the story, which gives you some sense of Du Bois's thinking in 1920. And so nearly 2 decades after he published The Souls of Black Folk, seeing that conditions had not really in a dramatic or significant way improved. So you can see how he could become pessimistic. And then here we are, almost exactly 100 years later. So if you think of the so-called racial reckoning of 2020 that happened in the summer, at the very moment in which we were in the grip of a global pandemic, we're still trying to find our feet in connection to that. So I think that's a very interesting parallel to observe between our present conditions and the ones that we find surrounding Du Bois in 1920. So, I mean, we're not dealing with a comet whose noxious gases could potentially kill whole populations, but we're dealing with a global pandemic that has killed millions of people around the world. So I think it's really interesting to see these parallels. So are you guys, did you have more to go on?
That would be all, actually.
Okay, cool.
One thing to add on to what you were talking about earlier too, kind of like within history and like education and such, and you brought up like not knowing their history, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And that was definitely like one turning point for me too in high school, when like we did a family tree thing and I could only trace back like a couple ancestors on the Black side of my family, but on the white side I could trace back, you know, to a crazy amount. And so I did like a DNA test this last year, like around the time when everything was going on, because I just was very curious. And like I have the app on my phone that kind of like tells me everything. And on the Black side, it's very just like, okay, like 50 something percent South African. And it gives you back to like the few grandparents that I did know. But on the white side, it breaks down like every little thing possible. Like it's, you know, like 3% of this, 5% of this, 6%, like it breaks down each category within that and has traced back like an insane amount of relatives and or like grandparents and ancestors and stuff. And I think that's also like one thing that really made me think about or getting interested in like learning more about my own history, because there's like a stopping point where like I can't go any further compared to
Yeah, that was really no accident when it comes to the development and practice of the transatlantic slavery movement that emerged in the 16th century. That wasn't an accident. And that's something that we see paralleled in the concept of scalability when it comes to running plantations, for example, that still exist now. So like in palm plantations, for example, you want to render the crops more or less abstract. That is, they have no relations to other plants. You get rid of all plants so that you have a monocrop. So there's no relation to the kind of patterns of life through which this vegetation emerges. And the same was done to living, actual human individuals. So it was a deliberate practice to abstract them away from the material and historical conditions by which they recognized themselves in a community. So you break the community, you break the historical roots, which ground that community, and then you can manipulate the psychological aspects of the individual. And so that's sort of another point of view on the originary processes through which double consciousness has occurred. As, by the way, according to Du Bois, a unique feature of African American consciousness. And so this is something that Baldwin talked about too, when we addressed Baldwin a few weeks ago after talking about Plato, that there's something really unique about the consciousness of African American individual as opposed to other individuals who might, of course, suffer from unequal recognition in different ways. But the point here is that subjectivity, what it means to be a subject, what it means to have consciousness, is not a static and given fact that one can simply take for granted. So if what we all are, what I am, what you are as individuals, are subjects, then it might seem as a matter of course to be a subject. It's the easiest thing in the world. You don't have to do anything in particular to be a subject. But what figures like Du Bois and Baldwin and Hegel even are bringing our attention to is that subjectivity is not a given. It's actually created in a process of subjectivization. And so technology, for example, subjectivizes us in different ways. So our contemporary consciousness under conditions of profound global media saturation is quite a bit different than the consciousness that was in processes of recognition and operation just decades ago. And so, of course, the lived concrete conditions and reality of those suffering under the operation and the historical vestiges of American chattel slavery and all the associated institutions and Jim Crow to follow and so forth, that's obviously going to have the effect of building subjectivity in a way that's clearly problematic and stultifying in terms of one's capacity to grow and develop in a healthy, flourishing way. But what's really interesting that we still have to talk about is there's something importantly positive about it too, that Du Bois kind of subtly teases out for our understanding. That is to say, that those who have been oppressed and marginalized, exploited and subjugated have in some important regard greater epistemic access to reality. That is, they have superior knowledge on the lived conditions of reality in concreteness than do the members of a dominant cultural group, those who are comfortable or not marginalized, not exploited. And this isn't necessarily tied to race exclusively, but it's found in conditions of inequality between genders, between socioeconomic status. So those who have profound wealth, for example, very frequently demonstrate complete ignorance, if not stupidity, when it comes to things. So just, this is a somewhat old example, but it really stayed with me years and years ago when the first George Bush was president. I think it might have been during a presidential campaign. He was asked a question about how much a gallon of milk costs. And his response was, I don't know, like $5? Like he had no idea. because it's not an issue for him. But someone who lives paycheck to paycheck or has an uncertain financial situation, they will very much know how much a gallon of milk costs, because that could be all the money that they have at the time, and they have to feed their children and their family. Does that make sense? Okay. So why don't we take just a quick break, and then we'll come back and finish this up. So let's just take 5 minutes. I'm going to run and get a sip of water. So that was a really great discussion. I appreciate the presenters, and we'll come back, and I want to focus in more detail and dig a little more deeply philosophically into this this phenomenon of double consciousness when we come back. So I'll see you guys in a few minutes. I'm going to pause the recording for now. All right. So I want to do some close reading. So I'm going to share the screen and take us, oops, I have to reclaim my host status. Okay. So I'll share the screen and take us to, oops, it's the wrong one. Hold on. I'll take us to the hypothesis reading. Let's see. All right. So now I'll share the screen. Okay, so we've discussed the veil at length, and today I sort of quickly, earlier this morning, suggested that the veil stands as a sort of image or figure for white supremacy, which is a kind of ideology. And it's a sort of ideology which is social. It is, in its very effort to sustain itself, it has this sort of operative tendency to expand itself across ever more global dimensions. But it, in doing that, recruits individuals. So there's a 20th century French philosopher, Louis Althusser, who has a very important book on the nature of ideology, its rudimentary conditions and its effects, and its pervasiveness and so forth. And ideology functions by recruiting individuals or hailing individuals, that is, calling individuals out. And he actually uses examples of a police officer, how a police officer will hail individuals or call attention to them, say, hey, what are you doing? And so we can think of the focus that the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, has brought to bear on white supremacy, police violence, and the isolation of Black communities, where the interaction of a police officer who enters a Black neighborhood, for example, where that individual doesn't live, enters that neighborhood almost as a representative of an occupying power, engaging with and recognizing the members of that community as hostile individuals. And so the police officer interacting with individuals there is going to hail or call attention to, point out, demand a response from individuals in the community much more differently than they would a white person, so a young white man in a white neighborhood, a police officer might even try to encourage them to join the force, right? To become one of them, to become a police officer. So we talked about the veil in that way. Now I want to focus more on the operative powers and effects of double consciousness to understand how it arises and how it's a bit different from similar, more recently developed sociological concepts, like, for example, code switching. So often a student in this sort of class will bring up the example of code switching, with which I think to some extent all of us are familiar, even if we don't know the name, even if we don't understand the concept. So we can make some distinctions there. But double consciousness first appears in this text. In our reading, that's page 5. So this is chapter 1 of our spiritual strivings. So he says, let's see, after the Egyptian, and so we read this together at the end of our Tuesday class, but after the Egyptian and the Indian, the Greek and the Roman, the Teuton and the Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see, so I'll just, because this is important, just so I know, everyone knows where I'm reading, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world, that is the other side of the veil. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So what is this two-ness? So what's going on? Does anything strike you as interesting or important in Du Bois's characterization or in this initial fleshing out of the concept of double consciousness? Does anything strike you as curious or interesting in this paragraph? Well, remember earlier, the very first paragraph, I'll just take you there now. And this, by the way, where is it? The question with which he begins this text after the forethought, the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? And by the way, this is arguably the very first moment in the development of what scholars refer to as Black existentialism. So existentialism is a largely European philosophical movement, or I wouldn't call it a school of thought, but it's something that really emerged by name, existentialism, in the early 20th century. So after Du Bois, yet we go back to the 19th century to sort of gather under the aegis of existentialism, proto-existentialist European philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard in Denmark, Friedrich Nietzsche in Germany. But now many scholars are identifying figures like Du Bois as exemplary of Black existentialism. So existentialism as a movement philosophically wants to focus on the lived material and historical conditions under which one has to strive after a kind of existence, living within forms of contingency and uncertainty. And so you can see a really powerful, the way that Du Bois poses it here, a really powerful expression of existential anxiety. What is it? How does it feel to be a problem? Such that as a Black person, a Black body, simply going about your everyday affairs in a given community, you nevertheless, wherever you are, your very presence self-presents or announces itself as problematic, as a problem. And of course, Du Bois doesn't mean that he himself is a problem in terms of being the source or moral cause that is being ethically or politically deficient in some way to generate these social ills that ought to be repaired. But rather, he's identifying the sense in which he, as a Black body navigating American social spaces in the 20th century, presents as a problem, as an issue, right? Because he becomes a physical marker of social racial tensions. And so that's how he has to live. So that gives us some insight into, some opening into the anxious psychic conditions that make up who he is in terms of his identity, again, in terms of his subjectivity. And so that's where we find then the appearance of this concept of double consciousness. That's how he's answering the question, which perhaps well-meaning white people sort of dance around in strange ways. And that's what goes on in the earlier part of this paragraph. He gives us this account of double consciousness. Okay. If I can find it again. Okay. So what's interesting at a first glance at this paragraph is, despite how compact, how condensed it is, there is a sense of positivity, as well as, and there's the ambiguity here, a sense of depressiveness, as we described at the beginning here, as Du Bois described at the beginning here, of being a problem. So veiled consciousness, then, in some sense at least, is potentially, but not necessarily, a positive, revelatory kind of consciousness, despite the horrific reality of having to live as a subject splintered in that way, in terms of one's self-identity. And so here in the very first sentence, it's presented as a gift and a second sight. So it's a gift or a second sight that is peculiar to the experiential conditions and consciousness of the Negro, which doesn't just mean a person of African heritage or Blackness, but specifically here, we're talking about an African American, which Du Bois understands to be the invention or product of white Americanism as an enactment of this sort of white supremacist ideology. So that's what he means when he's using the word Negro with a capital N here. It's something that was historically and materially created, and that's what makes the African American consciousness unique. So it's a gift and a second sight, but then before the sentence is even concluded, the thought seems to be separated by this dash. We're dealing with a world which yields this person, this kind of individual, no true self-consciousness. And so this is what we spent quite a bit of time discussing on Tuesday in connection to Descartes. So remember, for Descartes, what it means to be as a subject, as a consciousness, as a thinking thing, res cogitans. Remember, according to Descartes, that's what we all are. That's the principle of individuation, grounding personal identity. We are thinking things. And what does it mean to be a thinking thing? It means to participate in the powers of thought, which is a function of mind, which means that one is identical with mind, and mind is defined along Cartesian lines as that which is most simple and unitary. So our body articulates itself through various parts that can be in tension with one another. And this is, if you recall, how Descartes argued for the fundamental metaphysical separation of mind and body, that the body is in principle spatially divisible, whereas the mind is not. And he thinks that that's because an essential attribute that constitutes the mind, in contradistinction to anything material, is its absolute unity and simplicity. And that's what Du Bois is giving us the opportunity here to challenge, to some extent, at least when it comes to the consciousness and cognitive abilities, in terms of what's available for knowledge of those living through the African American experience. It is not true self-consciousness then in the Cartesian sense. That is, there are aspects of one's mentality, of one's very being as a thinking subject, that seem to stand in irreparable tension. And so that is, as he continues, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. And here we get the two sides of the doubleness, the two-ness, the duality. There is the individual's consciousness as an American, and then on the other hand, as Black. But conceptually built into the very concept, the self-conception in terms of pursuing one's own self-understanding and identity of the American side, is the implicit, at least, image of whiteness. So by American, he thinks we really mean white. Hence we get the two-ness. That's why you can say American and Black. And so the peculiar thing about this, though, if you examine the two sides of the individual's consciousness, enduring this double consciousness, when it comes to the American side, that's a perspective that's necessarily, and we were talking about this earlier, it's necessarily a partial, incomplete perspective, just as every perspective of every finite individual subject has to be, yet it postures itself as universal. So white is just normal, and everything that is non-white is a qualitative addition or alteration of that first primary normal status, which as normal erases itself. It sort of withdraws or disappears. And for this reason, that white American identity is then a perspective that hides itself, that conceals itself. So an individual that identifies as simply American and also happens to be white, they never are put in a place to see their whiteness. It's kind of like the air that we breathe in, or the water that fish swim through, which they're not in a place to recognize as water. It's simply reality. It's simply the world. And so here we're getting a hint as to how this double consciousness, for all of the horrific self-doubt and anxiety that it necessarily generates in the subject who is subjectivized by its processes, there is a kind of potential in it that is not necessarily a given. And so at the very beginning of the reading, Du Bois suggests that he was in some way out of the veil, and for the purposes of writing this account, of providing this narrative for the world, he's going to step back within it. But not everyone is capable, through what certain scholars like Lewis Gordon, for example, another contemporary scholar of race, calls potentiated consciousness, or a potentiated second sight. So the second sight or gift that Du Bois quickly references at the beginning of the paragraph is not a given. It doesn't emerge as a matter of course from the prior conditions of double consciousness. It's something that has to be achieved through difficulty. And this is one of the powers of education that we were talking about before. And so one can potentially see then, reveal the falseness of the perspective on the part of the American identity, claiming to be the universal identity. It's the simply normal way of things, which is then whiteness. So one can, through this possible potentiated second sight see that which normally withdraws or hides itself under this sort of false status of universality. So one can then, being a Black person who is thus not purely or properly squarely American, because that means whiteness, they can thus achieve a position or a perspective from which they can see that that false universality is in fact false, whereas for others it remains concealed, it remains covered over or obscured by its normality or its givenness, I should say. Okay, but now I wanted to talk a bit about Fanon. So Frantz Fanon I mentioned. So this is a great book I would recommend to everyone. Black Skin, White Masks, written in the 1960s by Fanon, who, along with being a post-colonial theorist, was also a practicing psychoanalyst who helped, and he was from Martinique, so it's a colonized island in the Caribbean. It was colonized by the French powers. And so he talks a lot about in his work, this book, as well as The Wretched of the Earth, which he published first. First, he talks about how the colonial subject under colonial oppression and subjugation is subjectivized. So they develop these patterns and structures of consciousness and subjectivity in profoundly different ways than do non-colonized or non-colonial subjects. But there's this really important passage that touches on, in a concrete example, that touches on double consciousness. And to deliver this example, we just have to imagine a perfectly ordinary, innocent scene. So he mentions sitting at a table that has white people at the table, and he wants to smoke a cigarette. And the cigarettes are on the opposite side of the table, as well as the lighter. And so to pursue his desire, Fanon recognizes that he has to get up, he has to extend his reach across several white individuals, he has to grab the cigarettes, he has to make all of these movements to achieve his desire, which ordinarily one would never consciously reflect on. You would simply get up and grab the cigarettes. And that's because we have, under ordinary conditions of consciousness, which he refers to in this paragraph, Du Bois refers to in this paragraph, this true self-consciousness, in conditions of ordinary, true, non-splintered, non-double self-consciousness, one pursues one's desire in such a way that's facilitated by the body, which then hides itself as it achieves its end. So for example, you need your body to reach across the table to grab the pack of cigarettes. But as you do that, your body sort of withdraws behind the intention. That is to say, your body is not in the foreground as an object of your experience, like the pack of cigarettes is that you want to retrieve. Your body typically disappears. Or if you want to drink a glass of water, I don't think about it. I simply extend my reach, and I have, because of what researchers call the body schema, and Fanon, I'll mention that in just a moment, he talks about that explicitly. My body schema is a set of various processes, kinesthetic, perceptual, vestibular, which has to do with the function of your inner ear and maintaining balance, for example. All these systems and processes go to work in such a way that implicitly I know where my body is, always. I have a sense of its position in space and how it's related to other objects in space. So without any conscious intellectual effort, I have a firm understanding of where my body is in the room. Even if I can't see behind me, I have a sense of what is behind me, so I know I can't back up too much or I'll run into my bookshelf. And I know if I want to reach and grab this cup of water to take a sip, I don't have to calculate the measure of distance to achieve this simple end. I simply go about it. So under normal conditions of consciousness, the body schema operates in such a manner that the body withdraws behind the pursuability of the intention. Yet, for a Black person surrounded by white people, they have to, and this connects to the Steve Locke story, he has to see himself as a body from the point of view of others around him, such as the police officers, for example, who will be perceiving him as a Black body and perhaps relating him, even if not relating to him, even if not explicitly racist, because of the effects of implicit bias. Locke knows that there's a real threat, right? If he makes one false move or one alarming or unnerving move to the police officers, they could draw their weapon and shoot him, or perhaps think that they're drawing a taser, but mistakenly pull out a pistol somehow and shoot him. So the example that Fanon uses is he has to be aware of his body as an object moving through space, because as he moves to grab the cigarettes, that could be perceived as a threat by those other individuals surrounding him at the table. So this is just a concrete example of how that works. So he says, let's see. And then we were given, this is Fanon from Black Skin, White Masks. And then we were given the occasion to confront the white gaze. An unusual weight descended on us. So the white gaze, recognizing that those who represent this sort of false universal perspective of whiteness are looking at you, are scrutinizing you. An unusual weight descended on us. The real world robbed us of our share. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in elaborating his body schema. So in the white world, the man of color, or we could just say the person of color, encounters difficulties in elaborating their body schema. The image of one's body is solely negating. It's an image of the third person. So the fact that he was compelled to see his body moving through space to satisfy his simple desire negated the subjectivity of his own consciousness, such that in that moment he was sort of reduced to the perception of the white gaze, taking on as exemplary then this sort of false universal perspective. So he says, all around the body reigns an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. I really like that line. An atmosphere of certain uncertainty. I know that if I want to smoke, I shall have to stretch out my right arm and grab the pack of cigarettes lying at the other end of the table. As for the matches, they are in the left drawer, and I shall have to move back a little. And I make all these moves, not out of habit, but by implicit knowledge. So that's the implicit knowledge I referred to, by which I'm able to, without thought, grab this cup of water to take a sip. A slow construction of myself as a body in a spatial and temporal world. Such seems to be the schema. So it's a construction of yourself, a kind of assumed image of your body in space. It's not imposed on me. It is rather a definitive structuring of myself and the world. Definitive because it creates a genuine dialectic between my body and the world. But then he goes on below and he says in the following paragraph, beneath the body schema, I had created a historical racial schema. So the body schema would then appear to be essential, foundational in its operation. And in that operation, it withdraws from thetic consciousness as an object that we would manipulate, because it becomes a condition for the possibility of navigating space and grabbing or manipulating objects. But his point is, there seems to be a historical racial schema that is even deeper than this psychological body schema, and that has the powerful effect of interrupting or displacing, complicating what should be ordinary and simple body schema. So that's the negative, problematic aspects with which individuals who are enduring the world through double consciousness have to grapple with, right? Okay, and to speak to that a little bit more, I mentioned this before in the context of the group presentation, but to go to the comment at the end of the story, so this is where a little bit of biographical detail will be helpful. But what happens at the very end? So after Jim and Julia part ways, Julia goes with her family, and Jim walks out, and then what happens? So who remembers what happens at the end? Anybody?
Is it his daughter or no? It might have been like one of his family members he sees.
Yeah, he finds his wife. So he
It's
learns.
his wife, and he
Yeah.
has the
Yeah.
baby. She has the baby, but isn't the baby dead or something?
Yeah, good. So he happily finds his wife. So he discovers she's not dead. And there were hints throughout that he wanted to go find out. But of course, Julia insisted on investigating whether or not her own family was alive. But it turns out his wife survived, but she's holding the body of their dead baby. And this is important because Du Bois's own child died after 18 months. And that story is given in chapter 11 of The Souls of Black Folk. So if you're interested, I would recommend that you read it. Or he shares an account of their experience with their infant child dying after just a little after a year old, died of diphtheria. But part of that chapter, Du Bois talks about his reaction to the death of his child. And this helps us to understand the problematic dimensions of double consciousness as a concrete lived reality. So of course, first when his child died, his immediate reaction is despair and sadness that any father or mother or parent would experience the death of their child. But then that was followed fairly rapidly by a weird feeling of relief that the child would never have to grow up to recognize the veil or to see the color line, would never have to grow up to develop double consciousness, that the child would be spared from that. So he has that thought, and then that thought is quickly replaced by guilt, by feeling guilty for feeling some relief or in some sense happiness that the child is dead. And so that's something really, I think, devastating and unique to the reality of double consciousness that would be unthinkable for those who don't experience that sort of thing. But yeah, any thoughts on that or anything else before we go? So we're just about out of time, but.
No, I think that's all.
All right.
For me, at least.
Okay, guys. So thanks for the presentation. I think you're all gone anyway. Okay, well, I hope you have a good weekend. So we will meet Tuesday just to talk about the final paper project. So I look forward to seeing you then. And make sure that you take a look at the assignment and the prompts. And if you have any questions, we can spend some time clarifying the assignment. Okay, so have a good weekend, guys. I'll see you.
Thank you. You too.